The auction was a big event in the small frontier town. Every year, townsfolk and settlers from the surrounding areas gathered in the square to bid on livestock, tools, and sometimes even land or goods from far-off places. The air was full of chatter, the clinking of coins, and the occasional excited yell of a successful bidder. It was a time when the community came together, sharing stories and gossiping as they went about their business. On that particular day, a figure arrived at the edge of town. He was a mountain man, known for his ruggedness and solitary ways. His name was Cole, and he was the type of man who didn't fit in with the normal life of the town. He wasn't interested in the comforts of a town that had been built by farmers and tradespeople. He lived off the land, in the wild, far from the reach of the busy settlement. The mountain was his home, and he had learned to survive it in ways the townsfolk could hardly understand. But there he was, walking into the auction, his boots crunching on the dusty path, his weathered face unreadable. His arrival didn't go unnoticed. People turned their heads as he passed, some nodding in recognition, others staring in curiosity. Cole was an unusual sight in the town. It wasn't often that someone like him showed up. The auctioneer, a man with a loud voice and a sharp eye for business, had just started the proceedings. He was a fast talker, quick to name off the livestock and tools on sale, his words spilling out in a stream of excitement. But then, he paused, holding up a piece of paper as if it were some rare and precious commodity. The crowd quieted. "Now, folks, we have something very unusual today," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the square. "A woman in need of a new home. Margaret, a widow, will be the next item for bid." The crowd fell silent, a wave of discomfort sweeping over them. It wasn't common for a woman to be sold at auction, at least not in this way. A widow looking for a new life with no family to take her in was something the townsfolk weren't prepared for. Margaret stood nervously at the front, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was an older woman in her early 60s with graying hair that had once been a rich brown. The years had taken their toll, leaving her with lines on her face and a slow, careful way of moving. But there was still something strong about her, something that made her more than just the frail woman the townsfolk might have expected to see. As the auctioneer spoke, Cole's gaze fixed on Margaret. He wasn't looking at her like the others were. The people in the crowd were whispering to each other, wondering who would step forward to bid on this older woman. Some seemed uncomfortable, some appeared uninterested, and others were already laughing. But Cole? He wasn't paying attention to the laughter. His eyes were steady, unblinking, focused only on Margaret. When the auctioneer turned to the crowd asking for the first bid, the atmosphere shifted. Everyone was waiting for someone to speak up, but no one did. The awkward silence stretched on, longer than anyone had expected. It seemed like the whole crowd was holding its breath, and then Cole spoke. His voice was deep, rough, carrying through the quiet air. "I want the 60-year-old woman," he said without hesitation. The crowd gasped. Some of them even laughed. It wasn't just that he was bidding on a woman. It was the way he said it with such certainty, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. People turned to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief, their laughter growing louder. The auctioneer, clearly caught off guard, cleared his throat. Well, that's certainly a unique choice, sir, but you can't just pick a woman without—" "I'll pay the price," Cole interrupted, his voice cutting through the auctioneer's rambling. "I'll take her. I'll take the woman." The crowd grew even more uncomfortable, the whispers turning into full-blown ridicule. Who was this mountain man, this outsider, who thought he could simply claim someone as if they were livestock? It was unheard of. A woman was a person, not an object to be auctioned. And yet here was this man, determined, without a care for what the town thought. The townsfolk had no idea what to make of it. The woman was older, far older than most of the women in the town. There were plenty of young women in the crowd, women who were fit and able, who could be married off, who could still bear children. Why would anyone want a woman so old, they wondered. They exchanged looks, some of them even shaking their heads, but Cole stood firm, his eyes locked on Margaret. He wasn't looking at her with judgment or pity, but with something else, a quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what she needed and what he needed. Too, Margaret herself felt the weight of the crowd's gaze. She could hear their whispers, the laughter that followed Cole's declaration. She felt embarrassed, but more than that, she felt a sense of helplessness. She had been alone for so long, Her husband passing away years ago, she had no children, no family nearby to care for her. And now, here she was, standing in front of a crowd, being sold as if she were some kind of commodity. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but what choice did she have? The auctioneer, still trying to regain control, started the bidding in earnest. But there were no other bids. It wasn't that the crowd was unwilling to pay, no, it was that no one wanted her. Not at that price, and not with the stigma of being an older woman in a world that valued youth above all else. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the auctioneer relented, calling the bid to a close. "Sold," he said, almost as if he were in disbelief himself. To the mountain man. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what to do next. Cole stepped forward, walking toward Margaret, his boots scraping the dirt beneath him. The woman looked up at him, her face a mixture of uncertainty and something else, perhaps a flicker of hope. Cole extended his hand, and after a moment, Margaret reached out and took it. There was a softness in her grip, a hesitation, but also an acceptance. "Come on," Cole said, his voice rough but gentle. "Let's get you out of here." The crowd continued to watch in stunned silence as Cole led Margaret away from the auction block, his step steady, hers a little unsure. People stared after them, their disbelief still hanging in the air. But neither Cole nor Margaret paid them any mind. They had no idea what awaited them in the days to come. But they were about to find out. As Cole and Margaret made their way out of the auction square, the air seemed heavier than before, charged with the murmurs of the crowd behind them. The townsfolk were still in shock, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They had never seen anything like this. The mountain man, known for his hard and solitary ways, had just purchased a woman, one much older than most men would consider. It was as if the whole town had been watching some strange, unscripted play unfold, and they couldn't quite understand the ending. But Margaret wasn't thinking about the gossip anymore. The laughter that had followed them out of the square echoed in her ears, but she tried to block it out. What was the use? There was nothing she could do about it now. The decision had been made, and whether she liked it or not, this was her new reality. She had no family, no place to go, no support, so when Cole had stepped forward and claimed her, it was a relief in some strange way. The path leading out of town was rough and narrow, a long dirt road lined with trees and patches of grass. The wind rustled the leaves, a quiet sound that filled the otherwise tense silence between Cole and Margaret. She walked beside him, trying to keep up with his long, steady strides. Her feet felt heavy in her boots, but she was determined to keep moving. There was no turning back now. As they walked, Margaret couldn't help but glance at Cole. He was silent, his face set in a serious expression, his eyes scanning the path ahead of them. His clothes were worn, the fabric faded and frayed at the edges. His beard was thick and untamed, his hands calloused from years of working with wood and stone. There was nothing soft about him, nothing particularly welcoming, yet there was something about his presence that made her feel safer. It was strange. But she couldn't deny it. She had expected him to say something, maybe offer some sort of reassurance, but he remained quiet. Margaret wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Perhaps he just wasn't the type to talk much, or maybe he was as unsure about this whole situation as she was. After a while, Cole glanced over at her, as if remembering she was walking beside him. He gave her a quick, almost awkward look before speaking. "You all right?" His voice was rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. Margaret nodded quickly, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was all right. She had spent so much time alone in her small house, isolated from others after her husband's passing, that she hadn't known how to feel about anything anymore. She had become so used to the silence that it was all she knew. "I'm fine," she said softly, unsure if the words were true. She didn't want to admit how uneasy she was feeling. Cole didn't say anything more after that. He kept walking, his pace steady, not rushing, not slowing down. Margaret could tell that he wasn't trying to force a conversation, but she also wondered if he didn't care to talk at all. She didn't know what to make of it. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know. The journey took them away from the familiar town and into the wilderness. The tall trees closed in around them, casting shadows over the dirt road. The world seemed to shrink as they moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the town growing fainter with each step. The air grew cooler, the scent of pine and earth filling her nostrils. Margaret glanced at the sky where the sun was beginning its descent. She knew it would soon be dark, and the thought of being out here in the woods with a man she barely knew made her heart beat faster. She had never been this far out of town before. Her life had been so small, so quiet. Now everything felt too big, too wild, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was making a mistake. Cole seemed to sense her discomfort. Without looking at her, he spoke again, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the wind. "There's a cabin up ahead. We'll rest there tonight. It'll be dark soon." Margaret only nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat felt tight as if words might get stuck there. What could she say? "Thank you?" She doubted that would even make sense. She wasn't sure if this man, this stranger, was helping her or taking advantage of her, and she wasn't sure which thought was scarier. The path became steeper as they climbed, the dirt turning to rocks underfoot. Margaret's legs were starting to ache, and she was finding it harder to keep up. She glanced over at Cole, who seemed unaffected by the difficult terrain. He was used to this, she realized. He had likely walked these trails many times, his body molded to the rhythm of the land. She felt the sting of embarrassment. She had spent her life in town, in the safety of her small house, never venturing far from the comfort of known paths. Now she was walking through the wilderness, struggling to keep up with a man who clearly didn't care about her discomfort. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Cole stopped for a moment and looked at her. His eyes softened slightly, though his face remained serious. "Been here before," he said simply. "You'll be all right." Margaret wasn't sure if she believed him. She hadn't been all right for a long time. Her life had been so quiet, so controlled, that she didn't know how to deal with the uncertainty of this new path. She didn't know how to handle the weight of Cole's presence, the unknowns that stretched out before her. But despite the fear and the discomfort, something inside her stirred. She had been alone for so long, but now, for the first time, she had someone walking beside her. It wasn't the ideal situation, and it certainly wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but there was a sense of something. As they climbed higher, the trees started to thin out and the landscape opened up. The sun was almost gone now, leaving only a sliver of orange on the horizon. Cole stopped once more, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "There's the cabin," he said, pointing toward a small structure in the distance. Barely visible through the trees, Margaret's heart gave a flutter of relief. They had made it. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until now, when the sight of the cabin brought a strange sense of calm. It wasn't much to look at. A simple one-room cabin made of logs and stone, with a small stone chimney poking out from the roof. But it was shelter. It was a place to rest. Margaret couldn't help but feel a little grateful for it, even if she wasn't sure about anything else. Cole led the way, pushing open the door with ease. The cabin was modest but sturdy. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a few pieces of furniture, and a bed tucked into the far side of the room. The fire in the stove had long since died down, but Cole moved quickly to stoke it back up, adding more wood to the flames. Margaret stood by the door, unsure of what to do. She felt like an intruder in this small, intimate space, even though Cole had clearly invited her here. She didn't know where she belonged in this place, or what her role was supposed to be. Cole glanced over at her, noticing her hesitation. "Make yourself at home," he said, though his voice lacked the warmth she might have expected. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't welcoming either. Margaret nodded, slowly moving toward the bed. It wasn't much, but it was a bed, and she was exhausted. She hadn't realized how much she needed rest until now. As she sat down on the edge of the bed, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to relax, to take in the quiet. There was no one around, no expectations, no demands. It was just the two of them in this small cabin, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but maybe it was the life she needed. The morning light filtered through the small cracks in the cabin walls, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. Margaret woke up slowly, the unfamiliar sound of the wilderness filling her ears. It was quiet here, too quiet. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside and the distant call of a bird, but that was it. The town's noise, the bustling, busy sounds of everyday life, felt like a distant memory now. She sat up on the bed, taking a moment to stretch, her muscles sore from the long walk the day before. Her hands were still stiff from years of living a life of quiet routine, and the stiffness in her joints reminded her that she was no longer a young woman. The truth of it was undeniable, especially now. She had never expected to find herself in this situation. alone with a man she hardly knew in the middle of nowhere. She glanced around the room, taking in the simplicity of it all. The walls were rough-hewn logs, and the small stove in the corner still smoldered from the fire Cole had started the night before. The bed, though modest, was better than the cold, hard floor she had grown used to, but the silence felt oppressive in a way. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. Margaret had spent many years living alone, but never in such isolation. She had always been within reach of others, neighbors, distant relatives, or even just the comfort of a town that was always just a short walk away. But now, there was only the wilderness stretching endlessly around her, with no one but Cole for company. As she stood and made her way over to the small window, she looked out at the land. It was beautiful in its own way. The mountains in the distance, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and the soft glow of the morning light. But it was wild. It was untamed, and that's what made it so different from the life she had known. Margaret wasn't sure how long she could live like this. She had never been the adventurous type, and though the solitude had been somewhat peaceful, this was too much. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread at the thought of spending the rest of her days out here, with no other company except for a man she didn't really know. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. There was no use in worrying about the future. She had no control over it, at least not right now. Her only option was to take things one day at a time, to see how things played out. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the door opening. Cole stepped inside, his usual silent presence filling the small room. He was already dressed, his rugged clothes well worn and practical, his boots caked with dirt from the trail. Margaret turned to face him, startled by the sudden appearance. "Morning," he said, his voice low but clear. It was the first time he had spoken since last night, and his tone was no different than before, rough, direct, and to the point. Margaret offered him a small smile, though it felt a little forced. "Good morning," she replied. Cole didn't say anything else. He moved to the stove, adding more wood to the fire to warm the cabin. The heat from the flames made the room feel a little less cold, but it didn't make the silence between them any easier. Margaret hesitated, unsure of what to say. She didn't know if she should thank him for taking her in, or if it was too early to make any assumptions about their arrangement. They were strangers, after all, and this whole situation was strange to her. She watched him work for a few moments, his back turned to her. His movements were efficient, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He wasn't looking for any conversation, and she didn't want to force one. After a moment, Cole glanced over his shoulder, as though remembering she was there. "I'm going out to check the traps," he said, his voice still gruff. "You can stay here or come with me if you want." Margaret wasn't sure what to say to that. Part of her wanted to stay in the safety of the cabin, but another part of her, maybe the part that had been quietly longing for something different, wanted to go with him. She had spent so many years stuck in her own little world, and now that she was out here, she couldn't help but feel curious about this new life. "I'll come with you," she said, surprising herself. Cole didn't respond, but the slight tilt of his head seemed to acknowledge her decision. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, and Margaret followed him, her boots crunching on the dirt as she stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the world seemed so still. The trees towered above them, their branches swaying in the wind. The path ahead was rugged, but Cole moved with ease, his steps sure and confident. Margaret tried to keep up, but she struggled to match his pace. The ground was uneven, and her legs felt stiff. She wasn't used to walking like this, on dirt trails through the wilderness. After a few minutes, Cole stopped, turning to face her. "You need help?" he asked, his voice still rough but not unkind. Margaret shook her head. "No, I'm fine." Cole gave her a quick glance, then turned back to the trail, continuing to lead the way. Margaret followed, her heart beating faster with each step. She wasn't sure why she felt nervous. Maybe it was the unfamiliarity of it all, or maybe it was because she was walking beside a man she barely knew, in a place she had never imagined herself. They walked for what felt like hours, the path winding through the trees and up small hills. Margaret's legs were sore by the time they reached a small clearing. Cole stopped, crouching down to check a trap that was hidden beneath some brush. Margaret stood a few feet away, watching him work. She had no idea how to help him or if he even wanted her to. but she couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for the way he worked. There was something about his quiet focus that seemed so different from the men in town. They were all loud, boasting about their farms or their businesses, but Cole? He didn't need to prove anything. As Cole inspected the trap, Margaret couldn't help but notice how at ease he was in the wilderness. It was clear that he was a man who had lived here for a long time, who had learned to navigate the wild with skill and patience. He didn't seem bothered by the solitude or the hard work. He was simply living. "Do you do this every day?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence. Cole glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I've got to eat," he said simply. Margaret nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had never really thought about where her food came from. In the town, it was easy to forget that someone had to work hard to provide it. Now she saw how much effort it took, how much skill. They spent the rest of the day checking the traps, collecting small animals that Cole would later prepare for dinner. Margaret helped when she could, but mostly she just followed him, watching him work, learning about this strange new world she had entered. It wasn't easy. The labor was tough and the wilderness was unforgiving, but there was a sense of peace in it all. By the time the sun began to set, the air had turned colder. They made their way back to the cabin, tired but with a sense of accomplishment. Margaret's muscles ached, but it was a different kind of ache, one that came from doing something useful. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had earned her place. As they reached the cabin, Cole paused and looked over at her. "Tomorrow we'll head out farther," he said, his voice still quiet. "There's more to do." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the journey ahead of her. She didn't know where it would lead, or if she would ever truly get used to this life. But for the first time, she felt like she might just be able to survive it. The next morning came early, the sky just beginning to lighten with the first signs of dawn. Margaret awoke to the sound of birds calling outside, their songs rising and falling in the cool morning air. She had not slept well. The cabin, though a place of shelter, felt foreign to her still, and the silence of the wilderness seemed almost too loud at times. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of leaves outside kept her awake, making her feel like an intruder in this wild place. But she had to admit there was something about the solitude that also brought a strange peace. She sat up in bed, stretching her tired muscles, and looked over at Cole. He was still asleep, his large frame tucked beneath a rough blanket. He hadn't said much since they had returned the night before, after a long day of checking traps and gathering food. His silence was something Margaret had come to expect, but it didn't make it any easier to understand. She wasn't used to being around someone who didn't speak much. It was odd, but perhaps she would get used to it. Margaret moved quietly around the cabin, not wanting to disturb him. She went to the small stove in the corner and started a fire, the warmth from the flames slowly filling the room. The smell of the burning wood was comforting, and the sound of crackling logs was the first noise that truly felt familiar to her in this place. As the fire grew, she found herself wondering about the life Cole had led before she came into it. He had been living alone in the mountains for who knows how long. He had survived by hunting, trapping, and living off the land. He had shown her that, and though she admired his self-sufficiency, she also couldn't help but feel that he was just as lonely as she had been. After a while, Cole stirred. He sat up, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment he just looked at the fire, his face blank. Then he stood, stretched his arms, and without a word made his way to the door. "I'll go check the traps again today," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "You can stay here or come if you want." Margaret nodded, her throat suddenly tight. She had been trying to figure out her place in all this, in this life she never asked for. The wilderness was harsh, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up. But part of her wanted to prove that she could adapt, even if everything about this life felt foreign. "I'll come," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I want to help." Cole nodded without a word, grabbing his coat from where it hung by the door. Margaret followed him outside, the chill of the morning air brushing against her face. She had grown accustomed to the quiet, but this morning felt different. There was a weight to the silence, a feeling of something impending. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. The sky was still overcast, with heavy clouds hanging low above them, threatening rain. Cole moved forward with his usual efficiency, not looking back to see if Margaret was keeping up. She did, though, trailing behind him through the thick underbrush. The path they took was familiar to him, but it was a struggle for her. Her legs were sore from the previous days of walking, and the rough terrain didn't make it any easier. After a while, they reached the traps. Cole checked each one quickly, his hands moving with the ease of someone who had done this countless times. Margaret stayed a few paces behind, watching him work. There was something about the way he moved that fascinated her. He was so sure of himself, of the land. He knew exactly what to do, where to go, how to find food, shelter. He didn't need anyone, and she wondered if he ever had. When the last trap was checked, Cole stood up and dusted off his hands. He turned to Margaret, who was still catching her breath. "We'll head back now," he said simply. Margaret nodded, though she didn't feel ready to return. She still had so many questions, but she wasn't sure if Cole would answer them. She had been asking herself why he had taken her in, why he hadn't just left her behind at the auction like everyone else expected. Maybe he had seen something in her, something he could relate to, or maybe he was just lonely. As they made their way back to the cabin, Margaret found herself lost in thought. She hadn't spoken much the past few days, mostly because there hadn't been much to say. The silence between her and Cole had become comfortable, but she also felt the weight of it. It wasn't that she didn't want to talk. It was that she wasn't sure what to talk about. "Do you have family?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking the quiet. She hadn't meant to ask it, but the question had been lingering in her mind for days. Cole stopped walking and turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable as always. "Why do you ask?" His voice was low, almost cautious. Margaret hesitated. She hadn't expected him to answer, but now that the question had been asked, she wanted to know. "I don't know," she said softly. I wonder why you're out here alone." For a long moment, Cole didn't say anything. He just looked at her, as if deciding whether to answer her question or not. Finally, he sighed. "I've been alone for a long time," he said, his voice steady. "This is where I'm meant to be." The words hung in the air, and Margaret felt a sense of heaviness settle over her. He hadn't answered her question fully, but she understood what he meant. He had chosen this life. He had chosen to live alone, away from people, away from the complications of society. Margaret couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. She had been alone for so long, but this was different. She had been forced into this new life, into this strange world where nothing made sense. They walked the rest of the way back to the cabin in silence, the question still hanging in the air, unanswered. As they entered the cabin, the warmth from the fire welcomed them. Cole immediately started to stoke the fire, adding more wood to the flames. Margaret stood by the door for a moment, watching him. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but she was beginning to realize that Cole wasn't someone who would offer easy answers. He was the kind of man who kept his thoughts to himself, who lived by his own rules. Margaret had never been like that. She had spent her life trying to find connections, to build relationships, to fit in. But here, in this cabin, she was learning that maybe the most important relationship was the one you had with yourself. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this life, for the isolation, for the hard work. But it was all she had now, and maybe that was enough. As the night began to fall and the fire burned low, Margaret sat by the hearth, lost in thought. She could hear the quiet crackle of the wood as the flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows on the walls. The cabin was peaceful, but it was also lonely, and as she looked at Cole sitting across from her, she couldn't help but wonder if they would ever truly understand each other. The journey back from town was quieter than the trip there. Margaret couldn't help but feel a weight pressing on her chest, the quiet of the mountains more oppressive than ever. She had expected to feel relief when they left, but instead she felt a strange sense of loss. The town, with all its familiarity, now felt distant and out of reach. The people she had once known, the life she had once lived, seemed like shadows of another time. A time that no longer fit her. Cole walked beside her, as always, his steps steady and sure. He didn't seem to feel the tension, the unease that had taken root in Margaret's heart. He was a man who had lived alone for so long that the world, with all its noise and expectations, had become irrelevant to him. Margaret, on the other hand, had always been surrounded by people, always trying to find her place, always trying to fit in. As they made their way back through the dense trees, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was out of place. The cabin, the wilderness, it was all so different from the life she had known. She had come here to escape, to find peace, but what she had found was a life that didn't feel like her own. She didn't know if she was ready for it or if she ever would be. When they reached the cabin, Cole immediately set to work, unloading the supplies they had brought back from town. Margaret stood by the door, watching him, her mind racing. She had never felt so lost. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. She wasn't sure why she asked, but the question had been eating at her. Cole glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Miss what?" "The town," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "The people, the life you had before. Do you ever miss it?" For a moment, Cole didn't answer. He looked at her as if weighing her question carefully. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to the supplies, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "No," he said after a long pause. "I don't miss it." Margaret's heart sank. She wasn't sure why she had expected him to say something different, but his answer still stung. She had wanted him to say something more, something that would make her feel like she wasn't the only one struggling with the silence, the isolation. But it seemed that for him this life was enough. He didn't need anyone else. He had the wilderness, and that was all he needed. Margaret turned away, unable to look at him any longer. She walked to the window and looked out at the vast expanse of trees, the mountains rising in the distance. The land was beautiful, untamed, but it was also unforgiving, and Margaret wasn't sure if she could keep up with it. As the days passed, Margaret tried to push her feelings of isolation aside. She threw herself into the work, helping Cole with whatever needed to be done around the cabin. They gathered firewood, repaired the roof, and cleaned the small garden they had planted. The tasks were simple, but they kept her busy, and for a while, she was able to silence the doubts in her mind. But no matter how hard she worked, the emptiness never seemed to go away. There were moments when she would catch herself, standing in the middle of the cabin, wondering what she was doing here. What had she come for? What was she supposed to be learning in this quiet, solitary place? Cole was always there, his silent presence a constant. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were always direct, practical. There were times when Margaret felt like he was trying to teach her something, but she couldn't figure out what. Maybe it was about surviving. Maybe it was about learning to live without others. But she wasn't sure if she wanted to live like that. She had spent so many years seeking connection, and now, out here, it felt like everything was slipping away. She had given up the noise, the expectations of the town, but in return, she had found only more silence. One evening, after a long day of work, Margaret sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. The cabin was warm, but the warmth didn't reach her heart. She had never felt so distant, so disconnected. She wanted to talk to Cole, to tell him how she felt, but she knew he wouldn't understand. He had chosen this life, and he was content with it. Cole was sitting across from her, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes were fixed on the fire, but there was a strange tension in his posture, as if he was waiting for something. Margaret could feel it too, the silence that hung between them, thick and heavy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret spoke. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cole's head turned slightly, but he didn't meet her eyes. "You needed a place," he said simply. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure what that meant. She had needed a place, yes, but now that she was here, she didn't know if she could stay. She didn't know if she could keep living like this, without purpose, without connection, without anyone to talk to. She had spent so many years surrounded by people, and now she was surrounded by silence, and the silence was louder than any words she had ever heard. "You're not alone," Cole added, his voice soft but steady. "You have the land. You have the cabin. You're not alone." Margaret looked at him, searching his face for some sign of understanding, some hint that he felt what she was feeling, but his expression was unreadable as always. He had always been this way, silent, distant, a man of few words. And yet, in his own way, he was right. She wasn't alone, but that didn't mean she didn't feel it. "I don't know if I can do this," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can keep living like this." Cole was quiet for a long time, and Margaret wondered if he would answer her at all. But finally he spoke, his words simple and blunt. "Then leave," he said. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she had heard him right. "Leave?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "But where would I go?" "You can go anywhere," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to stay here if you don't want to." Margaret stared at him, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to offer her an out, a way to leave. She had thought that by coming here she had made her choice and that there was no turning back. But now, faced with the possibility of leaving, she realized how uncertain she truly was. I don't know what I want, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. I thought I came here to find something, peace maybe. But I don't know if I've found it. I don't know if I ever will. Cole didn't say anything. He simply stood up, his movement slow and deliberate, and walked over to the door. He opened it and the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. If you stay, he said, his voice low, you'll find your own peace. It's not something someone else can give you. And with that, he stepped outside, leaving Margaret alone in the quiet warmth of the cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the stillness. Margaret sat there for a long time, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure what to do. She wasn't sure if she could stay, if she could keep living like this. But she wasn't sure if she could leave either. She had come here searching for something, and maybe she had already found it. Or maybe she still needed to find it. The night was still, the air cold and crisp. Margaret looked out the window, her eyes tracing the outline of the mountains in the distance. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but for now the only thing she knew was that she would take it one step at a time. The town appeared to be much like Margaret had left it, quiet, familiar, but with an air of change. As they approached, she could hear the sound of footsteps on the cobblestone streets, the occasional murmur of voices coming from the shops that lined the main street. The town hadn't changed in the time she'd been away, but it felt different to her now. It wasn't the home she remembered. It felt like a place she had left behind, a place where she no longer belonged. Cole walked beside her, his steady pace unchanged. He seemed unaffected by the sights, the sounds, the people going about their business. For him, this town was simply a stop, nothing more. Margaret, however, felt the weight of every step, every glance from the townsfolk as they noticed her walking with Cole. She could sense the judgment in the air, though no one spoke openly. Their eyes lingered, some with curiosity, others with disbelief. She had left this town and disappeared into the wilderness, and now she was back. But she didn't know if she could still call it home. They passed a small cafe where a couple of women were sitting, gossiping quietly. When they saw Margaret, their conversation came to a halt. The silence that followed was almost too much to bear. Margaret quickly lowered her gaze, walking a little faster to keep up with Cole. She could feel their eyes following her, their silent questions hanging in the air. They weren't the only ones staring. Everywhere she looked, she saw people whispering, giving her looks that seemed to say, "What is she doing with him?" The unease that had begun to settle in her stomach grew stronger with each step. What had she done? What was she supposed to say to these people? To her neighbors? To her former friends? She hadn't planned to leave, to disappear into the wilderness, and she certainly hadn't planned to return this way. Cole, as always, didn't seem to notice the stares. His eyes were fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here for the town's opinion. He was here for what they needed, and that was all. Margaret, however, couldn't shake the feeling that she had just walked back into a world she no longer understood. They reached the small general store on the corner, the place where everyone went to get supplies. Margaret hesitated, her heart racing as she looked at the door. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the people inside, to face the questions she knew would come. But before she could speak, Cole pushed the door open and walked in. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, and the warm scent of dried herbs and cured meats filled the air. "The fine miner," shopkeeper, an older man with a gruff demeanor, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes briefly landed on Margaret, and she could see the flicker of recognition before his gaze shifted back to Cole. "Well, looks like you made it back," the shopkeeper said, his voice rough with years of use. "I thought you'd left for good." He glanced at Margaret again, then back at Cole. "Got what you came for?" Cole nodded once, his face unreadable. "Yeah, just need to grab a few things. You got any traps left?" The shopkeeper grunted and pointed to the back corner of the store. "Got a few left. Take what you need." He turned to Margaret, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Been a long time, miss. You holding up okay?" Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure what to say. Her throat felt tight as though words were caught there, unable to escape. She had never been good at small talk, but today it felt impossible. "I'm fine," she managed to say, her voice quiet. "Just here to help. With the supplies." The shopkeeper nodded, though he didn't look convinced. He knew better. He knew why Margaret had been gone all this time. Everyone did, but he wasn't one to pry. He had his own life to worry about. With a grunt, he turned back to his work, leaving Margaret and Cole to gather the things they needed. Margaret followed Cole to the back of the store, feeling the weight of the stares on her as they passed the other customers. She could feel the questions in their eyes, the judgment. She didn't belong here anymore. She didn't know where she belonged anymore. Cole reached for a few things, more traps, some tools, and a bag of flour. He didn't look at her as he worked, his focus entirely on what they needed. Margaret stood quietly by his side, unsure of what to do. She hadn't been prepared for this. She hadn't thought about what it would feel like to be back in the town, to be seen again by the people who knew her before. They made their way to the counter, where the shopkeeper rang up their items. Margaret could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words hanging between them all. As Cole paid, the shopkeeper gave Margaret one last look, his expression unreadable. "You take care of yourself, miss," he said, his tone kind but distant. "The world out there's a tough one," Margaret nodded, forcing a smile. She didn't know what else to say. With the supplies in hand, they left the store and made their way back out onto the street. Margaret kept her gaze on the ground, feeling as though she were walking through a maze of memories, each one a reminder of a life she had once known but no longer fit into. People walked past them, their conversations picking up again, but Margaret couldn't help but feel out of place. It was as if the town had moved on without her, and now, returning felt like trying to slip into a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. When they reached the edge of the town, where the buildings gave way to the open countryside, Cole slowed his pace. He glanced at Margaret, his face still as unreadable as ever. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret nodded, though the question stirred something inside her. Was she all right? She didn't know anymore. She had come here looking for something, some connection to her past, but all she found was distance. The people she had once known seemed like strangers now. They were still the same, but she wasn't. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I'd feel different coming back, but it's not like I thought it would be." Cole didn't respond right away. He just kept walking, his heavy boots crunching on the dirt path. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice as steady as ever. "Sometimes things change," he said. "Doesn't mean you change with them." Margaret stopped walking and looked up at him, startled by the simplicity of his words. She hadn't expected him to understand. She hadn't expected him to say anything at all. But his words felt oddly comforting. It was like he was saying that it was okay not to fit in, that it was okay to be different. Maybe she didn't have to belong here anymore. Maybe it was enough to just be herself. The silence between them stretched for a few moments, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't heavy with unspoken thoughts. It was simply the quiet of two people walking beside each other, trying to figure out their place in the world. They continued walking toward the cabin, the weight of the town and its judgment slowly fading behind them. Margaret didn't know what the future held, or if she would ever fully find peace with the choices she had made. But for now, she had Cole beside her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As they reached the familiar path that led back to the cabin, Margaret took a deep breath. The wilderness was vast, the world uncertain, but there was something about this life, about being out here with Cole, that made her feel like she was finally learning to live again, and maybe that was all she needed to know for now.